10 years ago, a college student with about $30 worth of spare parts built a small bipedal robot in his dorm room, just to see if he could. This past week, the company that grew out of that experiment got the final green light to go public on one of the most closely watched stock exchanges on Earth, at a valuation north of $6 billion. If you want a single story that captures exactly how fast the humanoid robot industry has gone from science fiction to serious money, this is it. The company is Unitree Robotics. And on July 3rd, 2026, China's securities regulator gave it the official go-ahead to list on Shanghai's STAR market, the technology board, specifically built to fast-track China's most strategically important companies onto public markets. That approval was the last box left to check. Registration? Cleared. Regulatory review? Cleared. Everything standing between Unitree and a public listing has now been cleared, and the company is set to become the first humanoid robot maker in history to trade on China's domestic stock market. Let's talk about how absurdly fast this whole process actually moved, because the speed itself tells you something important about how badly Beijing wants this listing to succeed. Unitree filed its IPO application on March 20th, 2026. It passed its formal listing committee hearing just 73 days later, the fastest review ever completed under the STAR market's pre-review mechanism, breaking a speed record previously held by a Chinese chip designer called More Threads, which had taken 88 days. A little over 2 weeks after that hearing, the China Securities Regulatory Commission signed off on final registration. From application to approval, roughly 104 days, start to finish. For context, IPO reviews on major exchanges typically take the better part of a year, sometimes longer, weighed down by disclosure requirements, investor due diligence, and regulatory back and forth. Unitree blew through that entire process in about 3.5 months. When a government-run exchange moves that fast for one specific company, it isn't an accident. It's a signal. So who exactly is behind this, and how did we get here? Unitree's founder is a man named Wang Xingxing, born in 1990 in Ningbo, a coastal city in eastern China. He's not a typical Silicon Valley founder archetype, and his own account of his early years reads almost like the origin story you'd expect from a garage inventor, not a future billionaire. As a first-year engineering student, he built his very first small bipedal robot using roughly 200 yuan worth of parts. That's about $30 US, handcrafted, cobbled together, built simply because he wanted to know if he could make it walk. He went on to study mechatronics engineering, and for his graduate thesis at Shanghai University, he spent around 20,000 yuan building a prototype quadruped robot he called X-Dog. That thesis project became the seed of everything that followed. In 2016, Wang briefly joined DJI, the Chinese drone manufacturer, and one of the most successful hardware companies to ever come out of China. He lasted 2 months, then he quit to start his own company instead, registering Hangzhou Unitree Technology out of a 50-square-meter office in Hangzhou's Binjiang district. By his own account, in a later interview, the company's first 3 years were a genuine struggle. Reliably make payroll. It wasn't until late 2018 that the business started generating meaningful revenue and attracting real investor interest. From that shaky beginning, Unitree built its name first in quadruped. Robots, robotic dogs essentially, releasing a redesigned model called Lycago in 2017, then expanding into international markets, building a loyal following among researchers, hobbyists, and increasingly industrial customers who wanted rugged, affordable legged robots for inspection and fieldwork. The real turning point came in 2024, when Unitree pivoted hard into humanoid robots. In April of that year, the company unveiled its H1 humanoid. A few months later came the G1, a smaller, dramatically cheaper humanoid priced at roughly $16,000, a fraction of what comparable systems from competitors were charging. The G1 wasn't just cheap, it was capable, packing anywhere from 23 to 43 motorized, joints depending on configuration, with peak knee torque ratings rivaling machines that cost many multiples more. And then Wang did something that turned Unitree from an industry name into a household one, at least in China. He put his robots on national television. In February 2026, Unitree's G1 robots performed a synchronized cluster routine at China's Spring Festival Gala, the Lunar New Year broadcast that reliably pulls in more than 600 million viewers, making it one of the single most watched television events on the entire planet. The robots moved in tight, high concurrency coordination, showcasing autonomous locomotion at speeds up to 4 meters per second. It wasn't a lab demo, tucked away at a trade show. It was prime-time spectacle, watched by more people in one night than most Western tech launches reach in a decade. Wang has been candid about the strategic logic behind stunts like this. In his own words, before AI-powered robots can genuinely take on hard physical labor for people, performances like these let the company demonstrate real technological progress while generating commercial buzz and revenue along the way. It worked. Investor interest in Unitree, and in China's humanoid robotics sector broadly, surged in the aftermath. Now let's talk numbers, because the financial picture backing this IPO is genuinely unusual for a robotics company at this early a stage in the industry's development. Unitree's audited 2025 revenue came in at roughly 1.7 billion yuan, about $240 million US dollars, up an extraordinary 335% year over year. Gross margin landed above 60%, a figure that would be impressive for a mature software company, let alone a hardware startup building complex robots with dozens of custom motors and actuators. Profit, after stripping out non-recurring items, came in at roughly 600 million yuan. And according to the company's own prospectus, Unitree shipped more than 5,500 humanoid robots in 2025 alone, claiming the top spot globally in unit shipments with roughly a third of the entire world market. Within Unitree's own revenue mix, the shift has been dramatic too. Humanoid robots made up just under 28% of revenue in 2024, but by the first 9 months of 2025, that number had rocketed past 50%, officially overtaking the quadruped robots that built the company's original reputation. That said, it hasn't all been a straight line upward. The company's first quarter 202% year over year, a dip attributed to sharply higher spending as Unitree races to scale production capacity and expand its research and development ahead of the listing. Growing fast and spending fast tend to go hand in hand, and investors evaluating this IPO will be watching closely to see whether that spending translates into sustained margin expansion once the new capacity comes fully online, or whether it signals the beginning of a more difficult capital-intensive phase for the business. The IPO itself is targeting roughly 4.2 billion yuan in proceeds, approximately 619 million US dollars, through the sale of at least 40.4 million shares, representing a minimum 10% stake in the company. At that scale, Unitree's implied valuation sits somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 billion yuan, or about 6.2 billion US dollars. Compare that to where the company stood barely a year earlier. A Series C funding round in June 2025 valued Unitree at roughly $1.7 billion. In other words, in the space of about 12 months, Unitree's valuation has climbed by more than 3.5 times. Few industries move that fast. Fewer still do it with a hardware company that's actually shipping. Now, real profitable products, rather than burning through venture capital on unproven prototypes, which is precisely the distinction Wall Street-style investors, even domestic Chinese ones, tend to find most reassuring about a story like this. And the list of backers who've piled into Unitree along the way reads like a who's who of Chinese corporate power. Early rounds pulled in Hongshan Capital, the China-focused successor to Sequoia Capital's OCAL operations, along with Matrix Partners China, Shunwei Capital, founded by Xiaomi's Lei Jun, and Vertex Ventures. Meituan, the food delivery and services giant, is in there too. But it's the June 2025 Series C round that really signaled how seriously China's biggest technology conglomerates were taking this bet. Alibaba, Tencent, China Mobile's investment arm, Ant Group, and Geely Capital, the investment vehicle tied to the automaker behind Volvo, all C. O led that round alongside Jinqiu Capital. When 4 of China's largest technology and telecommunications companies all decide to write checks into the same 18-month-old humanoid robot pivot, that's not speculative dabbling. That's a coordinated bet on where an entire industry is heading. Founder control remains tightly held too, which matters for anyone thinking about what this company will actually look like as a public entity. Wang Xingxing holds around 24% of shares directly, closer to a third of the company's total economic interest once indirect holdings are factored in. But thanks to Unitree's dual-class voting structure, he controls just under 69% of total voting rights heading into the listing. That's an overwhelming amount of control for a founder to retain on the EV of a public offering, and it tells you that whatever direction Unitree takes as a public company, how aggressively it expands, which markets it prioritizes, how it balances flashy consumer demonstrations against slower industrial deployment, that direction is still going to be set almost entirely by one 36-year-old engineer who dropped out of a drone company after 2 months to build robots his own way. It's worth zooming out here because Unitree's IPO doesn't exist in isolation. It's the visible tip of an enormous wave building underneath China's entire robotics sector. According to a 2025 market research report from CCID Media, a division of China's Center for Information Industry Development, the country had more than 140 humanoid robot manufacturers operating at 400 units, nearly 85% of the entire global market. China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology has confirmed that domestic manufacturers had already launched more than 330 distinct humanoid robot product models by that same year. And by 2026, more than half of China's Henschel and municipal governments had formally written embodied intelligence and robotics development directly into their official government work reports, a level of coordinated policy alignment that's genuinely difficult to find anywhere else in the world for a single emerging industry. Unitree isn't racing toward the public markets alone either. Dobot, already listed in Hong Kong, is now pursuing a dual listing on Shenzhen's Chinex board. Leju Robotics is advancing its own IPO plans out of Shenzhen. Deep Robotics is on a parallel track toward a Shanghai listing of its own, having recently closed a pre-IPO funding round led by a national AI industry fund. China's broader onshore IPO market has been showing real signs of life too. A-share listings across Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing raised roughly $7.7 billion in the first half of 2026 alone, up more than 60% from the same period a year earlier. Unitree's listing is arriving at exactly the moment Beijing appears to be using its capital markets deliberately, opening the tap specifically for high-tech, strategically important sectors, robotics chief among them, as part of a broader push toward what officials increasingly describe as technological self-reliance. Now, no honest account of Unitree's rise would be complete without addressing the controversies that have followed the company just as closely as its investor money, because they matter for understanding exactly what kind of public company this is about to become. In May 2024, footage broadcast by Chinese state television showed a Unitree quadruped robot equipped with what appeared to be an automatic rifle, participating in joint military drills between China and Cambodia. Unitree has stated publicly that it does not sell its products to the People's Liberation Army. That statement did little to settle the broader concern in Washington. In May 2025, the U.S. House Select Committee on China formally asked federal agencies, the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Defense, to investigate Unitree's potential connections to the People's Liberation Army and China's broader military-civil fusion programs, the policy framework under which Chinese civilian companies are expected to support military modernization when called upon. In June 2026, just weeks before this IPO cleared its final hurdle, the U.S. Department of Defense went a step further and formally added Unitree to its list of Chinese military-linked companies. There have also been serious cybersecurity concerns raised by independent researchers. In September 2025, security researchers published findings alleging that Unitree's G1 humanoid robots were collecting and transmitting multimodal sensor data without notifying operators, and that the same underlying weaknesses could theoretically be exploited in offensive cyber attacks. The same group of researchers also disclosed what they described as a wormable vulnerability affecting Unitree's GO2 and B2 quadrupeds, as well as the G1 and H1 humanoids. A flaw that, if exploited over Bluetooth at close range, could allow an attacker to gain full control of one unit and then use that compromised machine to spread the same exploit to other nearby. Unitree robots. Unitree declined to comment on those findings at the time. And separately, in April 2025, other security researchers alleged the company had built backdoors into its products that would allow remote access to Unitree devices and potentially to other devices sharing the same network. None of that has slowed the money coming in, at least not yet. Whether it eventually will, once Unitree is a publicly traded company subject to far more intense scrutiny and disclosure obligations than it faced as a private venture-backed startup, remains one of the genuinely open questions hanging over this listing. Public markets have a way of forcing exactly the kind of transparency that a fast-scaling hardware company racing to hit ambitious shipment targets doesn't always love providing. Elon Musk himself has weighed in on Unitree's technology more than once, and not always in the way the company might have wanted. When Unitree released a demonstration video, Musk reposted the footage and offered a blunt one-line assessment. "The future of war," he wrote, "is drone warfare." It's a reminder that even as Unitree markets its humanoids through viral kung fu videos and primetime television dance routines, the underlying technology sits at an uncomfortable intersection of consumer novelty, industrial utility, and dual-use military relevance, a tension that isn't going away just because the company is about to start trading shares. So what does Unitree actually plan to do with the roughly $620 million it's about to raise? According to the company's own prospectus, the funds are earmarked for exactly what you'd expect from a manufacturer trying to cement a first mover, lead before competitors catch up. Further research and development into the robotic AI models that let these machines learn new physical tasks, continued development of the robot bodies themselves, the actuators, joints and dexterous hands that let a humanoid actually manipulate objects in the real world, new product development, and critically, construction of an expanded, dedicated smart robot manufacturing base. That last piece may end up being the most consequential. Unitree currently competes on price as aggressively as it competes on capability. Its full humanoid lineup ranges from an entry-level R1 Air at under $5,000 all the way up to a flagship H2 model near $30,000. undercutting most Western competitors by a factor of 5 to 10. Sustaining that kind of pricing at much larger production volumes requires exactly the kind of manufacturing infrastructure this IPO money is meant to build. There's a broader industry lesson buried inside Unitree's specific story, too, one that stretches well beyond just one company's balance sheet. For years, the received machines were fundamentally a research curiosity, fascinating to watch, wildly expensive to build, and years, maybe decades, away from any kind of meaningful commercial viability. Unitree's IPO is a direct challenge to that assumption, backed not by promises or investor decks full of future projections, but by audited revenue, real gross margins, and thousands of actual robots already shipped to actual paying customers. Whether that success proves durable once the company faces the full weight of public market scrutiny, quarterly earnings calls, activist shareholders, analyst downgrades, all the pressures that come with being a listed company rather than a privately funded one, is the real test that begins the moment trading opens, not the one that just ended with this regulatory approval. Let's put Unitree's public listing into a competitive context too, because the company isn't just racing against domestic rivals scrambling toward their own IPOs. It's operating inside a genuinely global contest over who ends up owning the humanoid robotics industry as it matures from novelty into infrastructure. On the American side, Boston Dynamics Atlas remains by design, not for sale at any price, a research and demonstration platform rather than a commercial product. Tesla's Optimus, despite years of ambitious public promises from Elon. Musk isn't expected to reach retail customers until the end of 2027 at the earliest. Figure AI, another closely watched American humanoid startup, hasn't even disclosed pricing for its latest Figure 03 model. Set against that backdrop, Unitree stands out for a very specific reason. It is one of the only major humanoid robot makers on Earth actually selling functioning units today at prices real customers, universities, robotics labs, mid-sized factories, even individual researchers and hobbyists, can realistically afford to pay right now rather than someday. The gap between shipping product and promising product is arguably the single biggest advantage Unitree carries into its public listing, and it's a distinction public market investors, who tend to reward demonstrated revenue over speculative roadmaps, are likely to weigh heavily. Domestically, the competition is just as fierce, if not more so. Agabot, another Chinese humanoid manufacturer, has been shipping robots at massive scale of its own, targeting a lower price point with its base models to compete directly for the same industrial and research customers Unitree is chasing. Fourier Intelligence and UB Tech, the latter already publicly traded in Hong Kong, are both pushing hard into factory and logistics deployment, a slightly different lane from Unitree's mix of consumer novelty, research platforms, and industrial inspection tools. And, within China specifically, the field is getting more crowded by the month. Recall that industry tracking firm CCID Media counted more than 140 separate humanoid robot manufacturers operating across the country in 2025 alone. Unitree's first mover advantage in going public doesn't guarantee it stays the biggest name in the room. If anything, this IPO functions as a starting gun for the rest of the sector. Dobit, Leju, and Deep Robotics are all racing to complete their own public listings in the months ahead, and every one of them will be competing for the same pool of public market capital, the same industrial customers, and increasingly, the same limited supply of skilled robotics engineers. There's also the question of what happens to a fast-moving, founder-controlled hardware company once it becomes accountable to public shareholders for the first time. Private venture capital, however demanding, tends to operate on a longer leash than public markets do. Investors write big checks and wait years for outcomes, largely trusting founders like Wang Xingjing to execute without quarter-by-quarter interference. Public markets don't offer that same patience. Once Unitree starts trading, it will face quarterly earnings calls, real-time stock price reactions to every product delay or safety incident, and analyst coverage dissecting margins, production costs, and unit economics in granular detail. The nearly 48% drop in first quarter 2026 profit, driven by aggressive spending ahead of the listing, is exactly the kind of number that private investors were willing to look past in surveys. See of a longer-term growth story. Public market investors, especially the more short-term focused ones, may prove considerably less forgiving if that pattern of heavy spending against thinner near-term profit continues once the company is answering to shareholders every 90 days instead of every funding round. The star market itself is worth understanding a little better too, because the venue China chose for this listing wasn't an accident. Launched in 2019 specifically to give Shanghai its own answer to NASDAQ, a listing venue built for technology companies that might not yet meet the profitability thresholds required on more traditional exchanges. The star market has increasingly become the preferred stage for exactly the kind of strategically important, fast-scaling tech company Beijing wants to showcase to both domestic and international investors. Other recent star market listings include chip designers, memory chip manufacturers like Changxin Memory Technologies and Yangtze Memory Technologies, and AI model developers like Minimax. Unitree's listing there, rather than on a more conservative board, signals it's being treated less like an ordinary hardware manufacturer and more like a national technology champion. Grouped alongside the semiconductor and AI companies Beijing has explicitly identified as central to its broader push for technological self-reliance. That framing matters enormously for how the listing gets received, both by domestic retail investors eager to buy into China's robotics boom and by the government agencies that have made robotics, alongside quantum computing, sixth-generation telecommunications, and nuclear fusion, official pillars of the country's latest 5-year plan. None of that guarantees a smooth ride once trading actually begins. IPO approval and IPO success are two very different things, and China's markets have seen plenty of hotly anticipated technology listings stumble hard once real trading volume and real scrutiny arrive. Unitree will be entering public markets carrying real revenue and real margins, which sets it apart from many speculative tech listings. But it will also be entering carrying real geopolitical baggage, from the Pentagon's military-linked company designation to the unresolved CI, Burr security vulnerabilities publicly disclosed by independent researchers, any of which could resurface as a headline risk the moment the company's stock price starts moving. For now, though, the milestone stands on its own. There's something almost cinematic about the arc of it if you step back far enough. A kid in Ningbo who couldn't stop thinking about why animals can't talk, who built his first robot for the price of a cheap dinner out, who quit a stable job at one of China's most successful tech companies after just 2 months because he'd rather bet on his own idea. A company that nearly couldn't make payroll in its first 3 years. A pivot into humanoids that started with a $16,000 robot and ended less than 2 years later. A tour with synchronized machines dancing in front of 600 million television viewers on the most watched broadcast night of the Chinese calendar. And now, a regulatory green light that turns all of it into shares any investor with access to the Shanghai Exchange can actually buy. A CI, company that started with one engineer, a tiny office in Hangzhou, and a homemade robot built for $30 worth of parts, is about to become the first humanoid robotics firm anywhere in the world to list on a major domestic stock exchange. Whatever comes next for Unitree, soaring valuation, regulatory turbulence, fierce competition from a growing wave of rivals racing toward their own public listings or some combination of all three, the final hurdle standing between a decade-old dorm room experiment and a public company trading in front of the entire investing world has now officially been cleared.